Good morning, Doug. How are you?
Doing wonderful. Life is fabulous.
Good. Well, hey, we want to welcome everybody again, and today we're going to approach it a little different angle. Doug, we're going to talk about different situations that school administrators, SROs, all the different scenarios that could happen inside a school. There's a lot of talk about, I think, a lot of misunderstanding about what's allowed and what isn't allowed inside schools. And with this unfortunate shooting. Um, Up in the Detroit area, now there's talk of are the administrators culpable in this? Are they potentially liable? Just talk. Let's just talk about some of the different scenarios that administrators, school officials, and even SROs could have to face inside a building on what's allowed, what's not allowed, kind of how that all works.
Certainly. There's three areas that people, need to understand. That one, we're talking about school property, so that would be the locker. There is sort of a less of a privacy. There's a lower burden of privacy when you're searching something like a locker. The backpack itself is also another area, and then there's the person. And so those are the three type of areas that we want to talk about when we look at what the expectation of privacy is in those areas. And then the second thing we want to also understand is the difference in the type of search that's being done. Is it a safety issue, like the person was reported to have a knife or a weapon or a gun, or is it something to do with drugs, or is it something to deal with vandalism or some sort of theft or something like that? And so those are the areas that administrators work within, and they have to understand what they're doing at the time.
Sorry about that. So let's walk through some of those scenarios real quick. So if, let's say, administrators at the school, another student comes up and says, "Hey, I don't know this for a fact, but I have a strong suspicion that," let's talk about a potential weapon and not. So they come up and they say, "Hey, I think Jimmy or Susie has drugs in their backpack." What's allowed and what isn't?
So let's do this scenario. Teacher steps out of the room to talk to a kid. When she comes back in, her cell phone's missing, and it was on the counter, and now it's gone. So there's 20 or 30 kids in the classroom. Is it reasonable to assume that somebody either took that or might have removed it? And so the answer is yes, it's reasonable. So then you would say, okay, let's go ahead and bring in some staff, and we'll go ahead and search everybody's backpack. As long as you give everybody an opportunity. Did you take it? If nobody steps up and nobody knows anything, so we're in a situation it's reasonable to say someone in that room took that. So you could probably search their backpacks. You could also look at them, their body, and say, okay, if they have a cell phone and they put it in their front pocket, it's going to be seen from the outside. So searching that pocket becomes unreasonable because there's no way they can hide it in that pocket without you being seen. That would be sort of a reasonableness thing, is that you're attempting to resolve that crime in that regard. When you talk about the drugs thing, it would be something to the scenario of if somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, I just saw so-and-so and they were exchanging money for drugs. I know he's known for that," and stuff. And so would you have the ability to search that? And obviously that's a violation of the school rules. And so if you found that person, you would be allowed to search those two kids to see if they did have drugs on their person. One of the reasons you're allowed to do that is that the school is on some level responsible for those people. And so if at any time they're consuming those drugs on campus or something like that, there is a danger that could occur if those kids were using that substance on campus, which gives you sort of that reasonableness to say that. Now, if you had a school resource officer and you went to that officer and said, "Hey, we just got told those two kids are doing drugs, you should go look into that and see if that's a crime," that becomes unreasonable. That's where the officer would have to have the probable cause and that higher level, because you're now acting as an agent of the state and you're saying, "I want you to enforce your powers as a law enforcement officer on these kids." And so that's the other component we need to look at is, are you enforcing laws, communal laws that exist outside of the school, or are you enforcing policies that only apply to kids when they're in school for purposes of that? And so what we look at there is, it's reasonable to enforce policy. It's unreasonable to enforce laws outside of the school.
I'll take it a different step. A student comes up and says, "Johnny told me Jimmy has a gun in his backpack."
Okay, and so then where we look at is that's where it is extremely reasonable based on the risk to everybody else. And so then going and searching that kid's locker, their person, and their backpack the courts have shown is completely reasonable because of the inherent threat that exists and the duty to protect the kids in that classroom. And so, or in any classroom. And so then that's where you look at it and says, when it's a threat of violence or an implication of a weapon being involved, the reasonableness is much easier to achieve, in that you have a greater obligation to keep everybody safe. When we put it in the drugs component, it's important that we keep drugs out of our schools, but there is an inherent risk to every student in that building if some kid's walking around with marijuana in his pocket.
Right.
And so then that's why we need sort of that greater risk. What becomes unreasonable is, in January, I find a kid with marijuana in his pocket, and then every February, March, and April, when I see him, I just say, hey, I'm searching you. That becomes an unreasonable search because you're prejudging that person and doing that. But when we look at sort of the weaponization or the weapons that might be coming into the school, one of the things schools need to make sure they do is that when kids make threats or that they become involved in a situation, it should be standard and it should be in writing. And I would recommend you draft something with the legal department saying that as say your time in this school, you are subject to random searches based on the threats that you have perpetuated at this time. So that gives you cause within the future to say, we're just going to do a random backpack search, or we're going to do a random locker search, because the kid has shown tendencies in this regard. And the courts have found that to be reasonable because you're putting them on prior notice that they're subject to that.
Do students' cars also fall under that if they're on school property? I would assume they do. I don't know that, but
on some level, but they do have a protection in the sense of there are some protections to the vehicle. So you would have to have a direct reason to go to that vehicle. Weapons, things like that, obviously increase that. Where we have to watch out for is that, in some of these states where it's legal for 18-year-olds to have long rifles, you might have a policy that says no weapons on campus, but you also have a kid who might have, say, ammunition left over from a hunting trip, or they're going with their friends on a Friday, and so they put everything and they secured it in the trunk of their car. Those are the type of things where you can't be too unreasonable, but also understand that there might be some legal protections that child has or that student has because they are 18 and legally allowed to possess a weapon. And so those are things that are cautious. You can't always rely on the fact that the weapon is on campus unless you have a very strong policy that has been presented that says absolutely not, and you're discussing this with the kids saying these type of things will not be tolerated. All of that has to be in writing and done and in place long before you were to ever search a kid's car because you were told he has a weapon in the car.
And so is this a case where if the school district has done all those things, they've got the very strong written policy, it's been well communicated, it's in the student handbook, parents sign off on it, everybody signs off on it. Is this a case where the policy overrides the law, even if it's a case where that student might be 18 years of age?
In that sense, yes, because it's no different than your house, if or a business or anything like that. Where if I have a business that says, and I'm going through the proper notification that concealed carry isn't allowed on my property, and you come on my property with the concealed carry, my rights as a property owner are not superseded by your rights as a concealed carry holder. So my rights supersede yours because it's my property. In this regard, the school has said our ability to prevent weapons from being on campus it supersedes your right to carry that weapon, and therefore you have to keep it off. So the answer is yes, just like they can keep you from coming onto the property, even though it's public property. They can say, because of your actions at this football game, you're banned for the rest of the year, stuff like that. So those sort of things, yes, in those regards, will supersede the law in that regard. It's
interesting because I think there's so much misunderstanding, or lack of understanding, maybe I should say, of how these things apply. I've always said that I used to always tell my kids, of course, they're all grown now, but when they were younger, I'd say, listen, you don't have any rights when you step on school property. We'd have these and I think that's a safe way of approaching it. That may sound very harsh and maybe overly direct, but they would say, well, this person, so-and-so, they wouldn't look through his locker, and I don't know how they can do that. Well, it's not their locker. It's the school district's locker. If they want to search it, they can search it. And but I think there's a lot of misunderstanding or lack of understanding on what applies and how it applies. I think what you just said about giving the example of the concealed carry or the open carry in the states where, I know here in Oklahoma where we live, they have constitutional carry, open or concealed. And so it's basically, if you can carry a sidearm open carry or concealed carry. And now but you'll see the signs in restaurants is where you normally see them. We do not allow concealed carry, or we do not allow, whatever. And I know people get offended by that, but that's a good explanation, I think, where it talks about, obviously private property owners have a right to say what's allowed and what isn't on their property. So I think that's a good thing to understand.
Yeah, as adults, when we try and explain this to our kids, some of the things, reasonable expectation is what we talk about, reasonable expectation of privacy. If you're at work and you're using a work computer, you can't if you're doing personal business, understand that you forfeited your expectation of privacy by using their equipment. But if you're on your phone at work, they can't come in and say, hey, you're at work, we get to search your phone. Work vehicle versus, company vehicle versus a personal vehicle. You have autonomy when you bring that vehicle onto the property of the company to have your personal items safe from search. But if you're driving a company vehicle and they suspect you might be drinking or something like that, and they want to search your car and make sure there's no bottles of alcohol that are open in there, you have no expectation of privacy in that vehicle.
Right.
And so that's the type of stuff that happens is when you're in that school, when you're using their lockers, you don't have that reasonable expectation of privacy. You do with the backpack, but for the safety purposes and for the greater good and for policy violations, there is a reasonableness as long as there is a justifiable suspicion that you might be violating some policy, that they can search that backpack. Now, your greatest expectation of privacy is on your person. And again, this is where we talk about how reasonable is it. The biggest mistake I think that most administrators make, one is they get law enforcement involved too quickly, because we really do want to be handling these within the school. This is that whole idea of restorative justice, where as long as this is something that can be handled at the school and that we can gain sort of compliance with policy by those kids, that's what we want. But the other thing too is laying your hands on somebody is sort of that sort of very personal thing. So to touch someone, to actually search them is, going to be something that people are going to question. What I strongly recommend is, especially in the case of weapons, is you have something, even as something as simple as a stapler. And so if I take that stapler and hold it in my hand and I rub that on your pockets, or I rub that around your waistband, or I rub that up and down near your ankle, I'm not touching you personally, and it's a hard object. But if it hits metal like a knife or a gun or whatever, it's going to make a clinking sound. And if I hit something on somebody's pocket and I ask what that is, I would just say, what are those? And they say keys. And so then I'm like, okay, go ahead and take those keys out and put them on the desk and stuff like that. So I can search someone without ever having to touch them if I'm looking for a weapon. Now, obviously, that's harder when we're looking for smaller things like a pill or a small amount of, narcotics or something like that. But for those purposes, if you get somebody as a counselor that you're dealing with threats that should happen, then you should call another person in that room. So you tell them, hey, we're just going to do a cursory pat down of you to make sure you don't have any weapons on you. We're going to also search your backpack. And then after we do that, we're going to go check out your locker. If you explain those things, kids, then all of a sudden the parents, what are they going to say? That, well, we didn't like the way he was treated, but at least the search wasn't too intrusive.
And now that brings up a point, because I've heard people say this, coffee talk, right? Where a high school student will be searched and they're a minor, and the parents will say, well, how can they search a kid with the parents not there?
Well, that comes down to the threat and the notification. I strongly recommend, if you are going to be at this situation, you would have had the parents there. But it's the type of thing that before, like, let's just go back to Oxford. They asked the parents to take the kid out of school. The parents refused. At that point, you say, fine, in order for him to stay, these are the three things that are going to happen. Locker search, backpack search, and we're going to search his person. And by the way, every morning for the next 3 weeks, he's going to have to come to the front office or come to the SRO's office or come to the counselor's office. And we're going to search his backpack. We're going to search his person. We're going to make sure. So he's going to have to check in with us. And just so you know, randomly throughout the course of the next month, we're going to have the ability to go talk to him, see how he's doing. But he's also going to be subject to random searches at those times. That's what should happen in the situation where you make a threat like this. And then you just have other people to do it. The other great thing is that by doing that, you're checking in with that student every day. So you're checking in saying, hey, how was your day? How are things going at home? What's going on? And that's what schools are missing. When it comes to searching students, if anything involves sort of like theft or whatever, yes, you need to get involved with the parents, because if that search becomes intrusive, that you're asking them to remove articles of clothing, even just shoes and socks, things like that, that becomes a very intrusive search that starts to get outside the scope of reasonableness. And that's what school administrators have to be leery of. What we want them to understand is an accusation made by one student against another does meet that reasonable suspicion. What you need to do is make sure, one, that it's documented where it came from. You still protect the witness that mentioned it, but you do need to make sure you follow up on that. Getting law enforcement involved is the second tier, but you got to understand, are you asking them to get involved as an administrator of the school or as a law enforcement officer? And he or she needs to be told that right up front, because that's going to change the level of information they need. In order for a police officer to search you or I, they need probable cause the crime is being or has been committed. And so in that regard, it's a much higher standard they have to meet in order to search someone. If they're just searching them as an administrator, that's going to limit, let's say you did find drugs on this person, you might not be able to charge them through the court system, but at least the administrator would be able to take action through the school policy because it was an administrative search.
There's so many moving parts, when we're in this. And I think that's one thing I like about our conversation today is again, it's the lack of understanding of how rules apply inside schools. And really, I think you could say any public building, right?
Yeah.
Whether you're a city hall or whatever, but compared to if you're just driving down the street in your privately owned vehicle and law enforcement wants to pull you over, there's so many variables that apply to make good, sound decisions. If you were going to give a couple, just in closing, just a couple of hints or a couple of cheat codes for folks out there on if you find yourself in a situation as a teacher or administrator, I know you've talked about it, but give kind of the top two things to look at before you decide what action you're going to take. What would those be?
So the biggest thing is understand what you're dealing with. When it comes to school safety, the courts are going to give you quite a lot of freedom to justify that search. So you will be allowed to search the lockers, backpacks, and the person. When it comes to school safety, that is paramount, and the danger and risk to other kids is going to supersede any sort of violations of a reasonable expectation of privacy. When it comes to things like theft, drugs, narcotics, anything like that, then it's more limited. But the thing I would tell them to focus on is it's very reasonable to search lockers and backpacks. It's extremely tight to search a person when you're doing an intrusive search. So if you are having to put your hands in pockets, if you are having to like reach forward through people's clothing in order to search jackets and things like that, you should be leery of that. If you want to search a coat, have them take the coat off and search the pockets that way. If they can remove a layer without being revealing, then yes, feel free to do that. Shoes are okay. Really, believe it or not, once you start getting into socks and things like that, you get a little more personal. So I would just tell you, telling someone to kick off their shoes, not a big deal if it can be done in privacy. So the biggest thing is I would tell you, at all costs, keep your hands off the kids to be safe. But if you need to, that's when you need to start notifying the parents if you do need to touch a person's body.
Yeah, and I think it's add it to the list of things that I think many people don't think about that we ask our educators to deal with on a daily basis, right? I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if all they had to do was educate kids? That'd be a great place to get to, where they could just worry about properly educating children, but they have to worry about all these other things. And in today's, this is me saying this just as an individual, I always say we're in such a litigious world that, every little thing seems to be litigated, now. And I know that sometimes that forces educators to make decisions that sometimes I think they even realize this seems a little overboard or a little, crazy that we're having to do it this way, but they have to do certain things a certain way to be quite frank, to protect themselves in the school district from litigation. I mean, it's such a litigious society. And ultimately what we're talking about, I'm going to say this, and I want to be clear about this. I'm not condoning drug use by kids, but if you compare a kid has a joint in their front left pocket and a kid has a gun on their person or in their backpack, I think most reasonable people understand that, that one time you don't search that kid and then they pull a gun out an hour later and kill a bunch of people, a horrible situation. I'd rather run the risk of being sued and be wrong than run the risk of not doing what I need to do and then have a bunch of people unfortunately be cut down by violence. So it's a tough situation that we put these people in every day.
Yeah, and again, I'd reinforce it. If it has to do with school safety and a weapon, then the search should be pretty good. But like I said, you can tell if someone's carrying a weapon without really having to do an intrusive search.
Right.
The most important piece of information I would tell all these administrators is don't be afraid to back down. You might call somebody in, his history, who he is, and somebody just said they saw him doing something and you can't find it, back off. Like sometimes we keep pushing, and that's where these lines get crossed. Sometimes it's okay if they get away with it. You search their locker, you search their backpack, you haven't found any Sometimes it's just better off to say, you know what, I'm just going to slow down here. A quick example I give you is that, as a police commander, and I moved up through the ranks from supervisor and commander, I'd show up on some of these scenes and some of these officers would have something, they knew that they had it or whatever, or I'd look at them and say, yes, you found the cocaine on this guy, but guess what? I really don't like the way you got into that search. Just let him go, right? We're going to take this as found property. Yes, it's a crime to have this, but you know what? I think the way you got it, so let's just take a step back and just there. But sometimes we have a tendency to push too hard, and you know what? It's better off just to, hey, if you send a very clear message by doing the search itself, that person knows that they're put on notice that the school's watching them. And so don't be afraid to take a step back and say, you know what? Good, let's go ahead and go back to the classroom, but document everything and say what you did. But don't keep pushing until you find what you think is there, because sometimes that's going to push you past that line.
Yeah, you go into an area you just shouldn't go into, and I think, and again, those judgment calls, boy, it's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback, but boy, it's tough when you're trying to make the judgment calls on the scene. I think that's part of the reason why training is so important. Obviously helping train administrators and folks in leadership roles where they understand, hey, here's these scenarios, practice those scenarios as a district. If you need help with that, if you need resources, reach out to you guys at SafeDefend. You guys can provide those things. But
let me say one thing. You just said it best: is don't do this in isolation. So if you're the principal, don't assume you have the market cornered on knowledge. Get a vice principal or a counselor or somebody else, even a secretary, and say, hey, going into this room, you have just as much as authority to tell me to stop. And so then all of a sudden, if that, like that principal might just need that extra person to say, I think this is just a little too much. Let's rethink this. And just have the secretary say, if you have a question, say, can I speak with you outside? And that'll let me know.
Great.
And so don't do this in isolation. Don't do something where all of a sudden you're the only decision maker.
That's great advice, Doug. And that applies obviously to this, but boy, that applies to everything in life, right? It's good to give people permission to check you a little bit in an appropriate way. But I think, again, we say this every week, our goal at SafeDefend is to make people safe, and that they go home at the end of the day safely to their families, and to try to prevent these things as much as you can. And then, as always, just try to do the right thing by these kids and the staff members, educators, support staff, everybody inside these buildings. So, Doug, I'll give you the last word.
Well, the biggest thing is that we don't want kids to become jaded, and we do want them to feel protected, not persecuted. And so that's why it's so important that administrators understand that their role is to nurture the student, help them become treated poorly. And the biggest violation anybody can ever have is have their person searched. So make sure that if you're doing that to somebody, you are completely justified in doing that.
Guys, thank you, Doug. I appreciate it. I want to wish everybody a great weekend. And again, we do this every Friday morning at 9:30 Central Time. And, and we have it. You have the ability to comment. If there's things in there you want us to discuss, reach out to Doug at SafeDefend.com. You can, this gets posted to YouTube and everywhere else. So hit the comments. Let us know if there's topics you want us to discuss. But again, appreciate your knowledge and experience, Doug, and wish you a great weekend. We'll talk next week.
Thank you so much, Phil. Enjoy.
Thanks, Doug.